Hello and welcome back. On today's episode, I'm joined by James Stull, owner of Turkey Systems. They're an MSP located down in Texas, focusing primarily on dental practices. James, it's great to have you back on the show. I know it was a great time chatting with you last time when we were talking about HIPAA compliance and considerations there. And I think we're going to have a great conversation today about small business and cloud computing.
Yeah, appreciate the invite. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So, as we kind of dive into this, I mean, you and we obviously know the benefits of cloud computing. We're both in the IT world, and we both leverage cloud computing on a daily basis. But for a lot of small businesses, they're still used to the traditional server, install a program on the server, and then install the client version of that software on the individual computers, and then connect those back to the server, and everything stays locally in their office, and it's kind of contained. And cloud computing kind of shifts that paradigm, and it's now you just open a web browser and go to a website and sign in, and use whatever software you want. There's no major fees, there's no major lift or effort required to kind of get that piece of software running in your environment. But from your perspective, could you give me a concise definition of what cloud computing is to you and your clients?
Well, to me and my clients, there's not much when it comes to cloud computing in the dental space. I know there are some providers, but um, a lot of it is still based. I joke that dentistry is about 10 to 15 years behind on the technology curve because it literally is. They still, most of them, most of my clients, they have a server in their office with software installed with a thick client on the workstations doing straight SQL calls because you can't put that in the cloud. Well, you can now, it just costs more. But it's very old school thinking, so to speak. But as far as definition, I always find it funny when people ask me, "What's your definition of cloud computing?" Because there's so many people that talk about that have different definitions.
Right.
Personally, I adopted the NIST definition of what cloud computing is, and essentially that you're renting another person's servers, but you have unlimited capacity because you can always add and remove more and have that flexibility to expand and contract resources as necessary. That's the simplest way of putting it.
Yeah, and I think some things that a lot of small businesses don't think about is you're not constrained by capital costs when it comes to cloud computing. You're able to kind of it's a pay as you go model, and so typically it's I need three users accessing this piece of software. I don't have to buy a server. I don't have to go out and buy an expensive license for that software and do all the labor up front just to get that working. I can go to that company and go, okay, let's rent three licenses of this software. And as my practice grows, as my business grows, I can scale that up if I need to scale that back down. It's kind of like obviously contracts and terms are different between each provider, but it's really something that you can kind of like turn on and off as needed, or at least scale up and down. And so a lot of businesses can see cost savings, at least on the capital expense side, by leveraging cloud computing uh, versus just the traditional on-prem approach. A couple other things that come to mind for me is there can be economies of scale when it comes to security. Like the typical small business doesn't have anywhere near the security budget of a large excuse me, of a large cloud provider like Microsoft or Amazon or Salesforce to secure the product that you're essentially leasing or using from them in a cloud environment. And so they're able to pour more resources and invest more time in securing that environment, keeping it up to date, and protected than your typical small business would be able to invest in securing their physical environment, their server. Um, any thoughts on that before we kind of move on to trying to define the different types of cloud computing for our audience?
Yeah, they're like you said, the benefit is you get to leverage their experience, their tools, but it's also a two-edged sword. You get enough to hang yourself. You need to know what you're doing out there, um, when it comes to like the infrastructure as a service, as we'll be probably talking about here in a minute, versus other software. Like if you sign up for a Gmail account, that you're leveraging cloud computing right there, the Google's version of. But there's really no configuration. The security side is your account, and that's the bulk of the security for when you have software as a service solutions like that, where you're given the whole application, everything. This is your nutshell that you work in. Whereas if you're building out infrastructure and you have resources and stuff to leverage, then you're on the hook for all the security, just like you would be in house. The biggest benefit to me, is the fact that you don't have to worry about, because they've got the big budgets. Uh, that thing's not going down. If your office building gets wiped out by a tornado or earthquake or fire or whatever, it don't matter. It's still up. It's in their data centers, which usually have redundancy, or you can add that redundancy to have it go, regionally or nationally or internationally, then just spin up in another location. Which that flexibility, that's the biggest benefit to me for the cloud.
Yeah, I mean, you kind of touched on the different platforms, and we'll get back, or the approaches, and we'll get back to that. But the key thing you just said there for me was that redundancy, that it's disaster recovery, it's operational insurance from disasters, from something going on. Like let's take a look at COVID, for example. Companies that weren't leveraging cloud native tools, and instead had a more traditional internal approach to how they operated their business. When COVID hit and lockdowns happened, at least here in the US, and people had to stay remote or businesses were shut down, if you wanted the business to stay operating, if you are using cloud software, well, your team goes home, they sign into a web browser. Yeah, there may be some security concerns that you need to put in place working from home PCs, or if they took their laptop from home, but they can just, it typically in a matter of minutes, we can get that resolved and sorted out, and then they can sign in and they can operate and your business stays running. Whereas if you're doing the traditional on-prem approach, with a server and thick clients and all that, you then needed to navigate a much higher barrier to try and get your team working remotely,
And a much
and
more
keeping your business.
expensive barrier, I might add.
Absolutely. It's a lot heavier lift. A lot of those applications aren't designed to work across things like VPNs and higher latency connections. They're designed to stay within inside the castle walls. And now like we as IT providers, we're kind of charged with trying to get those applications working in ways they weren't really ever developed or designed to do, at least
It's the
during COVID.
it's the old scenario of trying to shove a square peg through a round hole. It's
Yep.
tough to do.
Yeah, you can do it with a big enough hammer, but those hammers get very expensive very quick. Um, and so it just like leveraging cloud computing in today's day and age, it makes things easier for the small business to just operate, to get access to um, greater tools and applications that are more powerful than, and at a lower price point than what they could in the past. And it allows you to just your business to operate regardless of your location. If you want to take as a small business owner, want to take a vacation and work, like go to Tahiti for a month or something like that. Well, if you're using cloud apps, as long as your team back wherever you're based is good, you go to Tahiti, you get an internet connection, you throw your laptop open, and boom, you're working, you're responding to clients, sending emails, working in the same apps you were working in, from your office. Like location is no longer a factor when you're using cloud apps. Um, but you touched on earlier, a couple different types of cloud computing, um, software as a service, also known as SaaS. Uh, you've got platform as a service, or PaaS, and infrastructure as a service, I don't know. You ask two people, you're going to get five different pronunciations of these things. Um, But like software as a service, I think is the most common one that business owners today would have heard of. That's like things like Gmail you mentioned. That's software being provided as a service, whether free or paid. Things like Salesforce, Slack, all of those things where you're just paying a monthly fee and you get access to the application and its features. Platform as a service and infrastructure as a service, I think, are two that are, again, familiar for people that are in the IT industry, but less so for the typical small business owner. Could you explain to our audience what the differences are between platform as a service and infrastructure as a service?
One of my favorite models is the pizza as a service or pizza in the cloud. It's a diagram. You can Google it and you'll find a million images, and it explains all the different types of cloud out there. Because, like, your traditional on prem, where you have everything in your own building, that's like, you have all your own ingredients for your own pizza, you make everything together, you put it in your own oven, you pull it out. That requires the most work. It may be sometimes some of the cheapest ways of getting your pizza, but it's the most labor intensive, so it's not always cheapest when you factor in those costs. It's it You can make it however big or small that you want, which is nice, but you're limited on how big your oven is, things like that. Whereas your infrastructure as a service is kind of like a take and bake, where you go to the one of these take and bake places. They already have the pizza made for you. You just take it home, bake it yourself. It fits in your oven. You can get pretty much whatever size you want. You can have whatever toppings you want, but that removes a lot of the labor off of you. You're not having to mix the flour and stuff to make the dough. They've already got that done. Whereas platform as a service is like pizza delivery, right? You order up and be like, "Yo, give me my pizza." The delivery guy comes and brings it to you. That's platform as a service. Everything's done for you. You bring it. The only thing you're going to need to have, is a place to eat and something to drink, right? Everything else pretty much is provided for you. Whereas if you go to the restaurant and order there, everything's taken care of for you. Your drink, your place to eat, your pizza, or your toppings, it's brought to you. The cleanup afterwards is taken care of. So it's a full service. Yeah, and who doesn't love eating out? So, and that's really software as a service. If we look at examples of that, we'll pick on Microsoft for a minute, but Azure can do pretty much all of those things from infrastructure and platform. Most cloud providers can do both. And then software as a service, examples of like that is like Microsoft 365, Google Workspace, any cloud app, honestly, Canva, and the list goes on and on for software as a service solutions.
Yeah, I think that's a great way of looking at it, and it kind of bridges the gap and removes a lot of the technical barriers to understanding some of these concepts. So we'll absolutely put a link to that pizza as a service uh, page in the notes, because I think it's a great way of communicating something that just about everyone is familiar with: pizza and making it themselves, ordering delivery, going out for pizza, and whatnot, and kind of maps that to a technical approach that isn't very familiar for many people.
Oh yeah.
Um, personally, I'd never heard of that pizza as a
You
service.
you
So
never
that's
heard of
kind
the
of
pizza
awesome.
as a service diagram?
No, no, I've never heard
Oh,
of pizza as a
I'm
service.
gonna have to share this with you then.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, the one that I had always heard of was virtualization, and it's mapping to apartments
Yes,
and like rentals, and that's the one I was familiar with. And it's a fascinating experiment trying to map all the different approaches of virtualization back to an apartment complex and renting. Um, but I'd never heard of pizza as a service. So,
those illustrations make things so much simpler and easier because
oh, absolutely,
it's not that complicated. It doesn't have to be that complicated. Let me put it
yeah.
that way.
But if you start going down the rabbit hole, it looks very complicated.
When you get in the weeds, but that's when you need professional help. A
Hmm.
lot of these things like infrastructure as a service, they're not designed for a layman to go in and start spinning up boxes. You do
They can get
that,
very
you're going to
expensive
ask
very
for
quick.
a huge security hole.
Yep.
And so your security risk goes through the roof if you don't know what you're doing. And not to mention cost. these things nickel and dime the tar out of you, and those nickel and dimes are more like 20s and 50s,
Hmm.
not actual nickels and dimes. Those costs can add up very quickly.
Oh yeah. Oh, absolutely. And you touched on it right there. Is using anything other than SaaS or software as a service, like that whole you're going out for pizza and eating at the restaurant approach. You're responsible in a lot of ways for the security, for the environment, for tightening things down. And that's where a lot of businesses, small businesses in particular, think, oh, well, I can go to the platform, I can sign in, and I have access to click the same buttons just to spin up a SQL server, to give me a server OS, to do X, Y, or Z in this platform.
Mhm.
Um, and yes, that's absolutely true. We click the same buttons as you. We don't have like this magical interface behind the scenes, but what we do bring to the table is years and years of experience in how to best secure this environment. We take the goals of what you as a small business want to do and try and craft the best approach to provide the balance of security and function and operation, so that you're able to meet your goals in a secure way rather than just I've turned it on and yay, it works, but no one really knows how secure it is.
But that's the dangerous side of it too. All three of those pillars, you are responsible for the security of your area. Each has a different type of security risk. You know, infrastructure as a service, when you're spinning up servers and stuff, you got to secure the servers, you got to secure the software, things like that. Whereas on the far end, software as a service, you got to secure your accounts.
Yep.
And passwords are not enough. You need things like multi-factor authentication, hardware tokens or soft tokens. Uh,
Tying SaaS back to identity management platforms like Azure
exactly.
AD. Yeah.
Those things are vital, but also some of these software as a service applications, they give you enough to hang yourself to. You have to be careful that you don't open up a hole. You know, share things out to the web that you don't want shared. So you're still on the hook on security. It's just your risk is different, and you're more responsible for the access that you provide and how you authenticate against the system. Also, the technical limitations that the system provides. Sad to say, there are still software as a service vendors that don't offer true multi-factor authentication, and there's quite a few of them, unfortunately, especially in industry specific um, areas. And I'm still talking about dental.
Yeah, I think
Pardon me
dental is
while I
always
bang
going to be
my
about
head against
15,
my
20
desk.
years behind everyone else.
Yes. It's
But
like,
I mean, like
ah.
in a lot of, well, I'm going to call it more of a niche industry software package where it's okay, it's not something that can be kind of consumed by a lot of different businesses and different verticals, but it's more you're targeting one vertical, a very specific type of client. A lot of those companies, they're rather like taking a true SaaS approach requires almost complete rewrite of their tool set, of their entire technology
Oh,
stack to
absolutely.
properly set up, run, and secure the software in a cloud environment. And the cost of doing that, a lot of them have said, no, we're just going to do what's called the lift and shift. We're just going to take what we'd install on premise, we'll install it in the cloud. Basically, we'll host the server for you. And what we're not going to improve the software so that it functions like any other SaaS app. And we saw that a decade and a half ago with a lot of other software that was as cloud computing was just really becoming mainstream. And industry over time has shifted, and now a lot of companies have rewritten that software. But like dental, it just seems, and forgive me, we don't service any dental clients. We never have. So I've only heard anecdotally through you and others, but they've always tended to be a good 10, 15 or so years behind
Yep.
the general computing trend of other businesses.
Well, you do a lot of factory stuff. Man, back in my heyday, I did a lot of factory too. They're in a similar situation. Hey, we got this thing that we bought back in 1983 that's still running DOS, or I had a back when I worked for one manufacturer, our plating line was ran by a Windows 95 machine. Now, when I say back in the day, we're still talking like 2005, 2007. It
Mhm.
wasn't that far long ago. Um, and yeah, so scary stuff still today. But everybody has those has those types of issues, depending on their vertical. You know, some of these businesses, and that's the unique needs of every business. Some of these businesses, you know, you can run state of the art everything you need because they don't need much. They don't have a lot of crazy hardware requirements that you know medical industry has, or manufacturing. There's a lot of similarities between those two verticals when it comes to the technical space, I might add, with the way they're built. Because there are differences. Don't get me wrong with the technology, but from a pure technical standpoint of how it works, from an IT support perspective, anyway, there's not a whole lot of difference between an X-ray machine and a manufacturing machine. They still have a small IoT device called a PLC that runs the machine inside, and they still have to communicate on the network and things like that.
Oh, yeah. I
So
think
yeah, there's a lot of similarities.
one of the biggest differences though is in manufacturing space, at least like what we've seen is those DOS based controllers or computers that are controlling machines or controlling the plating line in your case.
Yeah, aren't those fun?
Oh my gosh. It's kind of fun to go back and be like, man, this is what computers were like back 20 plus years ago. Okay, well, let's make it work. And
Oh
it's a whole set of new challenges. You can't secure it. You can't support it in
yeah.
the same way. A lot of the tools that we use to support end users today, they basically look at that and they go, "Yeah, I don't know what any of this is. I'm not going to install. Good luck." And so it kind of makes you be more creative in your approach to supporting and securing them. But in a lot of, at least what we've encountered is what those machines are typically that computer. It's not really a computer in the sense that every normal person would consider it. It's effectively just a more powerful PLC, programmable logic controller, that's kind of
Essentially.
embedded in the machine. And for us, a lot of times we find the company that even made it is no longer in business. Like it's the
Hmm.
25-year-old machine that runs off of this thing. We're having to scavenge eBay and like used swap part stores and stuff like that to try and just have a stockpile of components when it fails.
I got an ad the other day online where this company makes computers that are compatible with Windows 95 and Windows 98, brand new computers.
Hmm.
It's like there's a market for that. That tells you how old some of these things that some of these companies are built. But you know, not to derail the conversation on old fun manufacturing stuff, getting back to the cloud aspect, that whole thing of, yeah, well, we just have all of our IT in house. Let's lift and you know, let's forklift it right up to the cloud and be done. That is the absolute worst, horrible way of migrating to cloud, because
Yep.
that's going to hit your bank account the hardest. And that's what a lot of people don't realize. Renting out a VM, a virtual machine in the cloud, is the absolute most expensive way. Now, if you rent out that VM for an hour a month, that's pretty darn cheap. But when you're running it for a full month, you know, 730 some hours on average, that gets really expensive really fast. Now you can do something. Some cloud providers, they go ahead and give you, you know, here's our rate, whether you run it for 1 hour or, you know, 730 hours. Whereas you know, like other cloud providers, like for example Microsoft Azure, you can use reserved instances to make that cost a whole lot cheaper. So you can do a 1, 2, or 3 year commit on that instance. And the nice part about it is they still give you the flexibility, even though you have that locked in essentially as a contract. It's only 12% of a cost to get out of it. So it's not a hard hit, but it saves you hundreds, if not thousands, depending on the VM size over the years. A much, much cheaper route to go, though, is the platform as a service. Essentially, instead of you building the servers and configuring everything on the OS level and up, the OS, in other words, the operating system, the servers provided for you, and you just put your software on there. That's what platform as a service is. Those are pennies on the dollar in
Oh yeah.
comparison.
Like
but
you
you
don't need
have
to
to have
stand up.
software built to use it. Please go ahead. I
No,
didn't interrupt.
absolutely. It's like the traditional on-prem infrastructure IT guy would go, okay, I need to move this application to Azure. Okay, let me go to Azure and stand up a SQL server because that's what they're used to running on-prem.
Yep.
And the reality is, you don't even need a SQL server in Azure. You can just go, I need a SQL database. So you don't have the overhead of the server OS, the SQL as an application, the database application, just to host your database. But it's the nuance, understanding the different approaches and the different offerings and how best to tailor that to the needs of the client and balance the costs and security and all of those various variables. Various variables. That's great. Uh, but that's where providers like us come in and are able to. We live in that type of environment. We understand it a lot more than your typical internal person that's going to be looking at it because they got a directive to move their business up to cloud computing because cloud computing sounds good for at an executive level,
Oh,
or that they think they can save money that way.
it's a sexy buzzword. All these marketers talk about you need to go to the cloud. We're a cloud first company. We need more white fluffy in our world. Yeah, that's great, but again, these providers give you enough to hang yourself,
Yep.
and it's easy to hang yourself if you don't know what you're doing. And
And
it's not uncommon for
there's
people to
really no
get.
flexibility with them either. It's you've said, okay, I'm going to use this resource, and if you use that resource, their resources were tied up. They had to pay for the power bill and the ingress and egress of data and the internet and all that. Like you used their service for that time. Maybe
Mhm.
they'll be nice the first time that you screw up if the bill isn't too bad. But I've seen stories online and talked to other providers where their clients did something, I'm going to say silly. I've got some other words that I could put in there where they racked up a bill of 30, 40, $50,000 in a month. And these are small businesses doing maybe 1 to 2 million a year in gross revenue.
Yeah,
And so like a 40, $50,000 a month bill is way out of what they should be paying in a properly engineered cloud environment.
but on the flip side, they did it to themselves. Because,
Yep.
like in Azure, for example, I'm using that a lot because that's what I'm most familiar with. You can set up budgets, and it'll tell you predictive analytics over the month. If you, for example, if your bill is normally 200 a month, right, for Azure resources, real small environment, just using a number, and all of a sudden a guy at one of your techs decides, hey, we need a firewall, so they add the Azure firewall, which is a great firewall, but it's also $1,000 a month. Whereas if you spin up your own firewall or just use the network security groups, which are free, your own firewall that you could spin up on a small VM would cost you, 100 $100 a month if you wanted to, depending on the size that you want. But you can put up budgets and set up forecasting events where you get alerts to keep those types of bills from happening. But a lot of people don't take the few seconds it takes to put in those budgets. And then they're the ones that get the bill shipped via UPS on their doorstep in a big box, via forklift, versus the guys that get it in a letter envelope on the back of a postcard. Um, Making sure that you use the tools that are given to you properly saves you so much, and makes it so much more affordable.
Yeah. I mean, I agree 100%. It's knowing the tools that are out there, taking the time to learn about them. And then if you knowing when to admit you don't know what you don't know and asking for help. There's nothing wrong with asking for help, for going to find resources that do this more frequently or live in those platforms to help hold your hand and guide you through the most appropriate um, environment decisions to kind of keep them within budget, to keep them secure and all that. Um,
Absolutely.
I, I think this has been a great conversation. To recap, some of the key bullet points from my side would be understanding what type of cloud computing you really need. Are you after the turnkey to go to the restaurant and eat, grab pizza at the restaurant where you don't have to lift a finger? Are you after something more involved where you want to kind of architect it? Uh, Making sure that you leverage budgets on those platforms, and try and understand what you're actually going to be paying for. And third, taking appropriate security measures, things like MFA, secure passwords, tying systems to identity management platforms when they work, and when they have that functionality available. Those are my three key takeaways. What would you say your key takeaways for the typical small business considering cloud computing would be?
Honestly, I totally agree with all three of those. Depending on which cloud environment you go with, or if you decide to go multiple, if you're big enough. Um, but let's just say you small business, you go with one. Making sure you understand the ins and outs of that system, or have a competent provider that can help you that's used to those environments. That's even better. Um, Otherwise, stick with software as a service type solutions, because those are built for your end user staff that are not technically inclined typically, and they've got great walkthroughs and guides. But even then, don't be afraid to ask for help and find a good, again, competent provider that can help you set those up properly, because those things are vital. Your whole business runs on this thing, so you need to make sure that it's done well. Knowing things like, for example, if you use Azure or whatever cloud provider, get to know their cost calculator before you start implementing something. Figure out the cost. Yeah, it doesn't sound that great to spend 10 grand on hardware, or 20 grand, or 30 grand, especially when you can turn that into, you know, 300-400 bucks a month in a cloud provider. But it's only going to be that if you make sure on the technical requirement side that everything is mapped appropriately. um, Cloud is freaking awesome when it comes to DR, because again, you've got that flexibility, a whole lot cheaper than on prem. And instead of spending 30, 40 grand on hardware, you could spin it up for the 5 minutes you need to test it, or, a couple hours or a couple days. And that costs you pennies on the dollar, if that much, because it's so much cheaper because you're just renting a server for that long. Um, those are the powers that cloud give you, and the flexibility. So leverage those benefits more. That's both a business as well as a technological discussion. So do not take those conversations lightly. Don't think, oh yeah, just throw some money at it and done. Take the time, take the proper time, test things out. Because just because you think it's going to be ABC doesn't mean it's actually going to be that way. It could be XYZ, and then you're screwed. Um, and then finally, leverage those budgets, because that's the number one thing. The two main keys is the cost of it can get out of hand very, very quickly. Now, a lot of companies suffered from that because they went overboard with their, it's so easy, just spin up another, instance, just grab whatever you need to out of there. Making sure that you're governing that appropriately. If your budget is, $1,000 a month for your infrastructure, then make sure it fits in that $1,000 a month. If not, then you need to look at what you're running, because there's probably a lot of monies that you could free up and get those uh, get those much more affordable. Likewise, don't be afraid of on-prem, because there's a lot of benefits to on-prem on a cost side, but definitely leverage cloud as much as possible, because that most of the time is going to be your cheaper and more secure route. Again, if you have it set up right.
Yep. I think that if we're going to sum up this whole episode, is cloud computing, when done right, is the best approach for the typical small business. Uh, but hey, I appreciate the conversation. Where can if any of our audience wants to get a hold of you, if they're dentists and have questions, or they're in the Texas area, how can they get a hold of you? Where can they find you?
Easiest thing to do is just go to my website, turkeysystems.com. That's turkey like the bird. Everyone wants to joke and say, "Is that turnkey?" I'm like, no, we don't turn keys. We go gobble gobble. So just turkeysystems.com.
Awesome. Well, hey, I appreciate it today. Appreciate your time, and yeah, we'll have you back on, I'm sure, again.